Now, before talking briefly about Alexander the Great, wanted to lay some foundational work as it relates to ancient Greece and the impact of Greeks, not just on their age and the emergence of Western society, but also Greek impact on the Near East and in some sense still to present day. And we'll look at that through various changes in Greek society, whether it be in warfare and war fighting or forms of governance. Now, various Greek city-states, whether they be Athens, Sparta, et al., they do give us examples of different forms of governance that we can still recognize in varying degrees to present age. Most of us have heard of tyrants or dictators, and many of those individuals will come to power generally through illegal means, extra legal means, what the French would call a coup d'etat, or a quick seizure of power. So tyrants, I think, dictators, that's an example we still have today that doesn't require a lot of explanation. How about this idea of an oligarchy, though? How many of you have heard of that? This idea of, or governance by a few, so specific individuals themselves. Ancient Sparta gives us a good historical example of that, and those interested in reading more about oligarchic natures, structures, so on and so forth, should look to ancient Sparta. In some ways, there are existing regimes in the present that match that sort of form of governance and structure as well. And then how about democracy? Democracy, in some ways, we can relate to ancient Athens. Now, we're not going to talk specifically about Pericles or Periclean Athens, or democracy, this notion of a rule by the people and what that might mean, and especially in some relation to the present age in American history. James Madison, the so-styled father of the Constitution, a president of the United States, once stated that as much damage can be done by an all-powerful people as an all-powerful prince. So what did he mean by that specifically? Was he really interested in the rule by the people themselves, or was he perhaps a little bit suspicious of how a majority in some sense might take advantage of or trample on the rights of a minority, as much as any king could per se? So again, from the Greeks we get this various notions and ideas of forms of governance, some of these very impactful on America's founding generation and America's founding thinkers, such as James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, et al. Now, just as the Greeks have given us the pen as part of the legacy, they've also given us the sword, or changes in military sort of formations, innovations, war fighting, various tactics. In some sense, they're sort of a living example of what will be one of Sun Tzu's maxims. Sun Tzu, in his Art of War, once wrote, "Know thy enemy and know thyself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril." Well, the Greeks recognized that they have a very powerful neighbor in the form of the Persians. They were not going to be able to defeat the Persians on land, largely because of the size of the Persian army compared to the number of Greeks that could be assembled together. Now, I know there's movies out there today like 300, which are entirely believable, right? Because all Greeks were dudes that were like jacked up on muscle milk. Come on, give me a break. But in some sense, at least, movies such as 300 do give us a insight into what was taking place in Greek warfare. Now, changes within the Greek system of doing warfighting, whether it be on land or at sea, we'll talk about briefly next. I want to start on land here and talk about the creation of this Greek phalanx. It's a new military formation, and or the creation of a hoplite or hoplite system. Now, hoplites in many ways were simply average sort of citizen soldiers. These were individuals that would leave their farms and fields and be able to come out and fight if need be at a moment's notice. So think of them as sort of Minutemen of the American Revolutionary era. And the creation of the phalanx then, this massing of individual citizen soldiers, would mitigate against individuals losing their nerve, so to speak. So if you're massing men 16 across, 16 deep, you're creating like human tanks of sorts. And this was new. This was a new military formation and a mobilization of an entire society, which was entirely new to the Persians themselves, and it helped the Greeks be able to offset the differences in Persian numbers during those wars. At sea, we also see that the Greeks would begin to design and perfect this new sort of warfighting naval tactics with the creation of the trireme. Trireme simply meaning 3 rows of oars, and what you would have then is 3 decks of individuals rowing, and on the front of the trireme or ship was welded or fabricated a large piece of iron or copper or whatever it might be. And almost think of it, if you could visualize a plow going through the soil. This is a plow on the front of a ship getting ready to go through the side of another ship. So ancient naval warfare literally was he who can slam the ever-living crap out of the other guy and break up his fleet and cause his enemy soldiers and sailors to drown most quickly. That was the side that was going to win. And so that the Greeks then begin to perfect this new form of naval weapon. And in some sense, the reason they did that was in reaction to the Persians. If the Persians outnumber them on land, the best way to defend your own soil is to not let Persians get there in the first place. So what we start to see with the Greeks here in the Mediterranean world is this notion that he who rules the waves could potentially rule the world. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about Great Britain. Now, it's difficult to talk about Greece without at least mentioning Alexander the Great. Most have heard of Alexander the Great, have come across perhaps some timeless quotes that come from him, such as those represented here. Perhaps my favorite is the one to the left on this slide that says, "I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I'm afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion." I'll let you think about that for a minute and try to apply that not just to the battlefield, but perhaps the corporate boardroom or your life in general. What is he talking about as it relates to leadership there? I want you to think about that. Beyond the leadership aspects associated with Alexander the Great, we have to talk a little bit too about these concepts of what we would call acculturation, 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 or cultural diffusion. Now, anthropologists, cultural geologists, et al. Come up with these fancy sort of terms, but what do they mean, really? Well, what they mean is this. When Alexander the Great marched his armies out of Greece, marched through present-day Turkey into the present-day Middle East, and started to conquer formerly exceptional civilizations such as the Persians, Egyptians, and even marched into India, for heaven's sake. Much of the known world, save perhaps the Chinese, were exposed to Greek armies and Greek warfare and Greek culture. But what Alexander the Great did, rather than to come in and impose Greek rule on those peoples, Alexander the Great himself tried to embrace various aspects of different civilizations. Example, he was very interested in the Persian religious faith Zoroastrianism. Now, some of this comes from his own education and his own upbringing. I mean, hell, if you're raised by and mentored by Aristotle, one of the great Greek philosophers, that says something, right? So in some sense, what we see under Alexander is this sort of warrior philosopher. There's this guy that has no problem going out and doing battle, but at the same time, if he can use the pen and appreciate the arts and so on and so forth, he's going to do that as well. So cultural diffusion then, as it relates to Alexander the Great, was the spreading of Greek culture across much of the ancient world. At the same time, the Greeks were embracing aspects of other cultures. So together what happens then is there's this degree of acculturation, which is where you're sharing different sort of great pieces of and aspects of each other's cultures to create something new. And that something new that was created here is what historians and others refer to as Hellenism. So if you ever hear of the term or see the term Hellenism, I want you to associate that not so specifically with Alexander the Great, but these notions of acculturation, the appreciation of other cultures to create something new and unique, and this idea of cultural diffusion as well. Now, before we move into Mesoamerica to conclude this lecture and this larger lesson on technology and society in the ancient world, I wanted to bring in a little bit of world history here too, in the sense that one of the common themes that I have, underpinning themes in my world history courses, are the differences between rule by fear and rule through toleration. And if we use Alexander the Great's example, would you, if asked, say that Alexander's use of cultural diffusion and acculturation, would that be more representative of rule through fear or rule through toleration? Further, which of those two might help foster greater trade between and across civilizations or nation states? And lastly, which of those two is more likely to win quote-unquote hearts and minds? Are you making friends of those in quote-unquote enemy lands, or are you creating insurgencies? These are larger questions that I want you to consider as we talk more specifically about technology and society in the ancient world.